The wrench slipped from Jomar's oil-stained hands as the sleek silver Maserati purred to life in his cramped Miami garage. He had spent 3 grueling hours diagnosing an electrical problem that had stumped 2 luxury dealerships. And now the $200,000 machine hummed with the precision its Italian engineers had intended. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What he didn't know was that the woman stepping out of the air-conditioned office building 20 miles away in Coral Gables, preparing to retrieve her car, was about to shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. Elena Rodriguez adjusted her Hermès blazer as she walked through the marble lobby of Rodriguez Automotive Empire, the luxury car company she had built from her adoptive father's modest dealership into a billion-dollar international corporation. Her heels clicked against the polished floors as employees nodded respectfully, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on the annual board meeting that would determine whether her latest expansion into electric vehicles would receive approval. She had no idea that somewhere across the city, a man who shared her distinctive dark eyes and the same stubborn curl in his hair was wiping grease from his hands, about to deliver her car and change both their lives forever. The call had come that morning from her assistant Maria, explaining that the specialized Maserati service center couldn't fix the mysterious electrical fault that had left her stranded at a charity gala the previous week. A small independent mechanic in Little Havana had somehow solved the problem that had baffled certified technicians. Elena had been skeptical, even slightly annoyed that her $200,000 car had been taken to what sounded like a neighborhood garage, but Maria assured her that this Jomar Santos had a reputation for mechanical miracles. Jomar loaded his 8-year-old daughter Sofia into the passenger seat of his weathered pickup truck, the Maserati secured on the trailer behind them. Sofia clutched her worn backpack, excited about the adventure of visiting the fancy car company, where rich people worked in glass towers. She had been drawing pictures lately of elegant ladies in business suits, though Jomar couldn't understand where these images came from since they lived in a world of engine blocks and tire changes. As they navigated through Miami traffic toward Coral Gables, Sofia chattered about her latest artwork while Jomar wondered if he was dressed appropriately for delivering a car to someone who probably spent more on lunch than he earned in a month. The security guard at Rodriguez Automotive Empire raised an eyebrow at the battered pickup truck pulling the gleaming Maserati, but waved them through after checking the appointment list. Jomar felt his palms sweating as they approached the pristine glass building that seemed to pierce the Florida sky like a monument to success he could never imagine achieving. Sofia pressed her face against the window, marveling at the fountain and manicured landscaping that surrounded the corporate headquarters like a palace garden. Elena Rodriguez commanded respect in every room she entered, but standing in the executive parking garage waiting for her car to arrive, she felt an unusual flutter of nervousness that she couldn't explain. At 35, she had transformed her adoptive father's single dealership into an empire that sold luxury vehicles to celebrities and business moguls across 3 states. Her corner office overlooked Biscayne Bay, her penthouse apartment featured in architectural magazines, and her personal net worth exceeded most small countries' GDP. Yet something about this morning felt different, charged with an energy that made her check her reflection in her phone screen twice before the elevator doors opened to reveal the parking level. Jomar guided the trailer carefully down the ramp into the underground garage, his daughter Sofia bouncing excitedly beside him as they descended into what felt like an automotive cathedral. Luxury cars worth millions of dollars lined the walls like expensive artwork, each vehicle representing more money than he had ever seen in his entire 37 years of life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The fluorescent lighting reflected off pristine paint jobs and chrome details that seemed to mock his own humble existence as a single father who struggled to pay rent on their small apartment above the garage where he worked. The woman who approached them moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any space she occupied. Her black hair was pulled back in a sophisticated style that had probably cost more than Jomar's monthly grocery budget, and her tailored suit suggested a life of boardroom meetings and corporate power lunches. But as she drew closer, something strange began happening in Jomar's chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with memory, and everything to do with something deeper and more primitive than conscious thought. Elena extended her manicured hand toward the mechanic, who had accomplished what certified technicians could not, prepared to deliver the polite but distant gratitude appropriate for hired services. But when their eyes met across the space between his working-class reality and her executive privilege, the carefully constructed walls of her professional persona began cracking in ways she had never experienced. His face triggered something that felt like déjà vu, but stronger and more disorienting, as if she were looking into a mirror that reflected not her appearance but her essence. Sofia Santos possessed the fearless curiosity that 8-year-olds often develop when they sense that adults are hiding important information behind polite smiles and careful conversations. While her father and the elegant businesswoman exchanged pleasantries about electrical systems and repair costs, she studied the woman's face with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle that no one else had noticed existed. The lady's eyes were exactly the same shade of brown as her father's, and when she smiled, the left corner of her mouth lifted slightly higher than the right, creating the same asymmetrical expression that Sofia saw every morning when her father made breakfast and tried to convince her that scrambled eggs were a gourmet meal. The handshake lingered 3 seconds longer than professional courtesy required. Elena felt an electric jolt travel up her arm as Jomar's calloused palm pressed against her soft skin, a sensation so unexpected and intense that she nearly pulled away in alarm. His grip was firm but gentle, the hands of someone who understood the delicate balance between strength and precision that came from years of coaxing life back into broken machines. But there was something else in his touch, a familiarity that made absolutely no sense given that she was certain they had never met before this moment. Jomar stared into Elena's face with growing confusion, his mind racing through possibilities that seemed increasingly impossible the longer he studied her features. The shape of her nose was identical to his own, a distinctive curve that his adoptive mother had always said made him look distinguished even when he was covered in motor oil. Her eyebrows arched in exactly the same pattern that he saw every morning in his bathroom mirror, and when she spoke, explaining the car's previous electrical problems, her voice carried the same slight rasp that he heard in recordings of himself speaking. Sofia watched the adults with the sharp attention of a child who had learned to read the spaces between spoken words, the meaningful silences that grown-ups created when they were processing information too complex or emotionally charged to express immediately. Her father's usual easy confidence around customers had evaporated, replaced by something that looked almost like fear mixed with desperate hope. The businesswoman seemed equally unsettled, her professional composure cracking to reveal something vulnerable and confused underneath the expensive suit and perfect makeup. The Maserati sat between them like an expensive mediator, its silver paint reflecting the fluorescent garage lighting and creating an almost theatrical backdrop for what was beginning to feel less like a simple car delivery and more like the opening scene of something life-changing. Elena walked around the vehicle, inspecting Jomar's work with the critical eye of someone who had spent her entire adult life around high-performance automobiles, but her attention kept drifting back to his face with a persistence that she found both irritating and inexplicable. Jomar began explaining the technical details of the repair with the careful precision he reserved for wealthy clients who might question his expertise, but his voice kept catching on certain words as he struggled to maintain professional distance from a woman who looked so much like him that casual observers might assume they were related. He detailed how he had traced the electrical fault through multiple circuits, identified a microscopic crack in a specialized sensor, and fabricated a custom solution using parts that cost 1/10 of what the dealership would have charged. But Elena seemed only half listening to his technical expertise. The silence that followed his explanation stretched uncomfortably long, filled with unspoken questions that neither of them had the courage to voice directly. Elena found herself studying Jomar's hands as he gestured, noting how his fingers moved with the same unconscious patterns she used when she was thinking through complex problems. His left hand had a small scar across the knuckles that matched one she carried from a childhood accident she could barely remember, and when he smiled at something Sofia said, his entire face transformed in a way that reminded Elena of looking at old family photographs from before her world had changed forever. Sofia broke the awkward tension by tugging on Elena's designer sleeve, with the fearless directness that children often employed when adults were being unnecessarily complicated about simple observations. The little girl pointed between her father and Elena with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating an obvious truth that everyone else was mysteriously overlooking. She announced that they looked like they could be brother and sister, her young voice carrying clearly through the underground garage and landing like a small bomb in the middle of their careful adult politeness. Elena's breath caught in her throat as Sophia's innocent observation crystallized the vague recognition that had been building since the moment she first saw Jomar's face. The possibility that had been lurking at the edges of her consciousness suddenly demanded serious consideration, though every rational part of her mind insisted that such coincidences only happened in movies and television dramas, not in the carefully controlled reality of her corporate existence where every detail was planned and managed and documented. Jomar felt his knees weaken as his daughter's words gave voice to the impossible thought that had been growing stronger with each passing moment in Elena's presence. He had spent 37 years wondering about his biological family, creating elaborate fantasies about siblings who might exist somewhere in the world, but he had never imagined that one of them might be standing in front of him in a luxury car dealership, wearing a suit that cost more than his annual income, and radiating the kind of success that seemed to belong to a completely different universe than his own. The parking garage's fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, casting harsh shadows that made every detail of their faces starkly visible as they stared at each other with new intensity. Elena noticed that Jomar's left ear was slightly higher than his right, exactly like her own, a minor asymmetry that her adoptive mother had always said gave her character. His hands shook almost imperceptibly as he processed Sophia's observation, and Elena realized that her own hands were trembling with the same fine vibration that accompanied moments of extreme emotional stress. Maria, Elena's assistant, chose that precise moment to arrive in the parking garage, her heels clicking against the concrete as she approached, with a tablet full of urgent messages and meeting reminders that suddenly seemed completely irrelevant. She took one look at the frozen tableau of Elena, staring intensely at a mechanic while a small girl watched them both with satisfied curiosity, and immediately sensed that she had walked into something far more significant than a simple car pickup. The professional bubble that had contained their interaction finally burst completely when Jomar asked the question that changed everything. His voice was barely above a whisper as he inquired whether Elena had ever been adopted, whether she had any memories of siblings from before her current life began, whether there was any possibility that they might share more than just an uncanny physical resemblance. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either connect their separate worlds or collapse under the weight of impossible hope. Elena's carefully maintained composure crumbled as memories she had spent decades suppressing came flooding back with devastating clarity. Images of a small boy with dark hair and gentle eyes, fragments of a childhood interrupted by tragedy and separation, the persistent dreams that had haunted her sleep for years, featuring a brother she had convinced herself was nothing more than imagination. Her hand flew to her throat as she struggled to breathe normally, the garage walls seeming to close in around her as the foundation of everything she thought she knew about her identity began shifting beneath her feet. Sophia watched the adult's emotional meltdown with the calm acceptance of a child who had always known that grown-ups carried secrets too heavy for casual conversation. She reached into her backpack and pulled out one of her latest drawings, a picture she had created the previous week without understanding why. The sketch showed a man and woman standing beside a car, their faces nearly identical, their hands reaching toward each other across a space that seemed both vast and negligible. She had titled the drawing "Family" in her careful second-grade handwriting, though she couldn't have explained why she felt so certain about what the image represented. The emergency board meeting that Elena called for the following morning felt like navigating through a minefield while blindfolded. She sat at the head of the polished conference table, surrounded by 12 of Miami's most influential business leaders, each representing millions of dollars in investments and decades of carefully cultivated professional relationships. Her usually commanding presence felt fractured as she struggled to focus on quarterly reports and expansion strategies, while her mind replayed every detail of the previous day's encounter with Jomar Santos. David Chen, the company's longest-serving board member and her adoptive father's closest friend, noticed immediately that something was profoundly wrong. Elena's legendary attention to detail had been replaced by distracted responses and frequent glances toward the windows overlooking the city, where, somewhere below, a mechanic was probably changing oil and rotating tires, completely unaware that he had triggered an identity crisis in one of Florida's most successful business executives. The presentation about electric vehicle market penetration that Elena had spent weeks preparing felt surreal as she delivered it to the assembled board members. Her voice maintained its usual professional authority, but internally she was drowning in childhood memories that had been surfacing all night with increasing clarity and devastating emotional impact. Fragments of a life before the Rodriguez family had rescued her from the foster care system. Images of a small boy who had cried when social workers separated them, promises that they would find each other again someday that had been forgotten under layers of academic achievement and corporate success. Maria sat in the corner taking notes, but her usual efficient focus was disrupted by concern for her boss, who had arrived at the office 2 hours early and had been staring at a manila folder on her desk without opening it since dawn. The folder contained information that Elena had requested from a private investigator she had hired overnight, a comprehensive background check on Jomar Santos that might either confirm her growing suspicions or prove that her emotional state was causing her to see connections that didn't actually exist. When the formal presentations concluded, and the board members began discussing strategic initiatives for the next fiscal quarter, Elena found herself studying David's face with new intensity. He had been present during her adoption process 28 years ago, had watched her transform from a traumatized 7-year-old into the confident executive she had become. If anyone knew details about her origins that she had been too young to remember clearly, it would be him, but asking those questions would require admitting that her carefully constructed professional identity was built on foundations that might be more fragile than anyone realized. The morning light streaming through the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated dust particles floating in the air like tiny pieces of evidence from a past that Elena had convinced herself was irrelevant to her current success. But as board members discussed market analysis and profit projections, she was remembering the sound of a small boy's laughter, the feeling of protective responsibility for someone younger and more vulnerable, the devastating emptiness that had followed their separation and had never quite healed despite all her subsequent achievements. 23 miles away in Little Havana, Jomar was experiencing his own crisis of memory and identity, while attempting to concentrate on replacing the transmission in a 1998 Honda Civic. His hands moved through familiar motions of mechanical repair, but his mind was replaying every moment of the previous day's encounter with Elena Rodriguez, analyzing each detail like a detective examining evidence from a crime scene that had occurred decades ago and was only now being investigated. Carlos, his 72-year-old roommate and surrogate father figure, watched from across the garage with the concerned attention of someone who had seen Jomar weather various personal storms but had never witnessed him this emotionally destabilized. The older man had known Jomar for 15 years, had provided stability and unconditional support during the difficult period when Sophia's mother had abandoned them both, but he had never seen his friend completely unable to focus on the mechanical problems that usually provided refuge from life's complications. Sophia was experiencing her own confusion as she sat at the small desk in the corner of the garage, supposedly working on homework, but actually drawing increasingly detailed pictures of the elegant businesswoman they had met the day before. Her 8-year-old mind was processing the emotional upheaval she had witnessed between two adults who had been trying unsuccessfully to hide their profound shock and recognition. The drawings showed Elena in various settings, sometimes standing beside expensive cars, sometimes reaching toward a figure that looked remarkably like her father, always with the same expression of surprised longing that Sophia had observed in the parking garage. The private investigator's report that Elena finally opened during her lunch break contained information that made her hands shake so violently she had to set the papers down on her desk and take several deep breaths before continuing to read. Jomar Santos, 37 years old, had been born in Miami General Hospital on March 15th, exactly 2 years before her own birth at the same facility. He had entered the foster care system at age 5 following the death of both parents in a car accident, had been separated from a younger sister during the placement process, and had spent 12 years bouncing between different homes before aging out of the system at 18. The sister's name had been Elena Maria Santos, and according to the records, she had been adopted by the Rodriguez family when she was 7 years old. Her original birth certificate, which Elena had never seen despite multiple requests over the years, listed her biological parents as Miguel and Carmen Santos, the same names that appeared on Jomar's documentation as his deceased mother and father. The evidence was undeniable, documented in official records that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking or emotional manipulation. Elena walked to her office window and looked down at the city sprawling below her executive tower, knowing that somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings was the brother she had been unconsciously searching for her entire adult life. The dreams that had haunted her sleep since childhood suddenly made perfect sense. The persistent feeling that she was missing something essential despite all her professional success. The inexplicable emptiness that no amount of wealth or achievement had been able to fill completely. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her office floor as Elena contemplated the complexity of what she had discovered. Jomar was not just any mechanic who had fixed her car through superior technical skill and ingenuity. He was the brother whose absence had created a hole in her life that she had spent 3 decades trying to fill with corporate accomplishments and material success. The little boy who had promised to find her someday had been working less than 30 miles from her office, struggling to support his daughter while she had been building an empire, both of them completely unaware that they were living in the same city. The realization brought with it a crushing wave of guilt and regret that threatened to overwhelm Elena's usual emotional control. While she had been attending private schools and Ivy League universities, developing business strategies and closing million-dollar deals, Jomar had been navigating the challenges of foster care, learning mechanical skills through necessity rather than choice, becoming a single father without the support systems that her adoptive family had provided her. The contrast between their divergent paths felt like a judgment on choices she had never consciously made, but had nonetheless shaped their separate destinies. Maria knocked softly on the office door, carrying another stack of documents that required Elena's immediate attention, but finding her boss staring out the window with tears streaming down her face in the first display of vulnerability she had witnessed in 5 years of working together. The sight was so unexpected and alarming that Maria immediately closed the door and approached Elena's desk, with the cautious concern of someone entering a room where something precious and fragile had just been shattered beyond repair. The phone call that shattered Elena's carefully controlled world came at 2:47 on a Thursday afternoon while she was reviewing quarterly projections in her corner office. Maria's voice carried an urgency that immediately commanded her complete attention, explaining that Sofia Santos had somehow bypassed building security and was currently sitting in the main lobby of Rodriguez Automotive Empire, asking every employee who passed by if they knew where she could find the lady who looked like her daddy. Elena abandoned her meeting with the chief financial officer without explanation, racing down 35 floors with a desperation that surprised her with its intensity. The elevator seemed to move with agonizing slowness as she contemplated how an 8-year-old child had managed to travel across Miami alone, navigate the complex public transportation system, and locate her corporate headquarters with a kind of determined precision that suggested weeks of careful planning and observation. The main lobby buzzed with confused activity as employees gathered around a small girl who sat cross-legged on the polished marble floor, her purple backpack beside her, calmly explaining to anyone who would listen that she needed to speak with Elena Rodriguez about something very important that involved her father and family secrets that grown-ups had been hiding for too long. Sofia's presence in the sterile corporate environment seemed almost surreal, her childish innocence contrasting sharply with the business suits and urgent conversations that typically characterized the building's atmosphere. Security guards stood at a respectful distance, uncertain how to handle a situation that their training had never addressed. The child wasn't threatening or disruptive, simply persistent in her polite requests to meet with the company's chief executive officer about what she described as a family emergency that couldn't wait for normal appointment scheduling procedures. Her calm confidence suggested that she had no doubt about the importance of her mission or her eventual success in accomplishing it. Elena emerged from the elevator to find Sofia surrounded by curious employees who were charmed by her articulate explanations and slightly concerned by the implications of an unaccompanied child appearing in their workplace. The moment Sofia spotted Elena across the crowded lobby, her face lit up with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning had finally produced the desired results. She stood up with the dignity of a person much older than her 8 years, and walked directly toward Elena with the purposeful stride of someone who had important business to conduct. The conversation that followed would be remembered by everyone present as one of the most emotionally charged exchanges they had ever witnessed in a corporate setting. Sofia began by apologizing for coming without permission, but explaining that sometimes children had to take action when adults were being too slow about solving obvious problems that required immediate attention. Her voice carried the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating simple truths that everyone else was mysteriously overlooking. Elena knelt down to Sophia's eye level, aware that dozens of employees were watching their interaction with fascination and growing understanding. The child's dark eyes held the same intensity she had noticed in Jomar's gaze, the same intelligence that seemed to see through surface appearances to deeper truths that others missed. Sophia reached into her backpack and withdrew a manila folder that contained what she described as evidence that would help the grown-ups understand what she had figured out through careful observation and logical thinking. The folder contained drawings that Sophia had created over the previous weeks, each sketch showing Elena and Jomar in various scenarios that demonstrated their physical similarities and suggested familial connections that the child had intuited long before the adults had been willing to acknowledge them. The artistic progression showed increasing sophistication, as Sophia had refined her understanding of the relationship between her father and the businesswoman, eventually creating detailed portraits that captured not just their appearance, but the emotional longing that she had observed in both their faces. But the most devastating piece of evidence was a photograph that Sophia had discovered hidden in her father's bedroom, tucked between pages of a mechanical repair manual, where he apparently believed it would remain safely concealed. The image showed two small children, a boy and a girl, standing beside a Christmas tree in what appeared to be a modest living room, decorated with handmade ornaments and inexpensive furniture. The boy's protective arm was wrapped around the girl's shoulders, both children smiling with the unconscious happiness of siblings who had never imagined that life might separate them permanently. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized herself in the photograph, her 7-year-old face glowing with the kind of pure joy that she hadn't experienced since childhood, when the world had seemed full of possibilities and family meant the unconditional love of people who shared her history and understood her completely. Beside her stood Jomar, unmistakably her brother, despite the decades that had transformed them both from innocent children into adults shaped by vastly different circumstances and opportunities. The lobby gradually emptied as employees returned to their duties, but several key staff members remained, sensing that they were witnessing something historically significant in the company's corporate culture. David Chen appeared from the executive elevator, having been summoned by Maria when the situation began developing beyond normal security protocols. His expression shifted from concern to understanding as he took in the scene of Elena holding the photograph, while Sophia explained her detective work with the pride of someone who had successfully solved a mystery that had confounded all the adults involved. Sophia's explanation of how she had connected the various pieces of evidence was delivered with the logical precision of a seasoned investigator presenting findings to a jury. She had noticed the physical similarities immediately during their first meeting, had observed her father's emotional reaction to Elena's presence, had discovered the hidden photograph during what she described as necessary research into family history that her father had been reluctant to discuss. Her conclusion was simple and irrefutable. Elena Rodriguez was her aunt, her father's missing sister, and the family that Sophia had always known was incomplete could finally be whole again. The security footage from the building's entrance showed Sophia's arrival 3 hours earlier, having traveled across the city using a combination of public buses and careful navigation that demonstrated remarkable maturity and problem-solving skills for someone her age. She had apparently been planning this expedition for weeks, studying bus routes and building layouts, saving money from her allowance for transportation, and waiting for an opportunity when her father would be too busy with work to monitor her activities closely. Elena found herself overwhelmed by the child's courage and determination, qualities that reminded her of her own persistence in building Rodriguez Automotive Empire from her adoptive father's single dealership into an international corporation. Sophia had inherited the family's tendency toward ambitious goal-setting and strategic thinking, applying those traits to reuniting relatives who had been separated by circumstances beyond their control for nearly 3 decades. The emergency that Sophia had created by her unscheduled appearance forced Elena to confront decisions that she had been avoiding since discovering Jomar's identity. The child's presence in her corporate headquarters made their family connection undeniably public, witnessed by employees who would inevitably share the story throughout the company and potentially beyond its boundaries. The careful privacy that had protected Elena's personal life from media scrutiny was now compromised by an 8-year-old who had decided that family secrets were less important than family reunification. David Chen approached Elena with the gentle concern of someone who had watched her navigate various personal and professional challenges over the years, but had never seen her this emotionally vulnerable. His expression suggested that he understood more about the situation than he had previously revealed. That the discovery of Jomar's identity had triggered memories and knowledge that he had kept confidential for nearly 3 decades at her adoptive father's request. The conversation that followed between Elena and David, conducted in whispers while Sophia entertained herself by sketching the lobby's architectural details, revealed layers of family history that had been deliberately concealed to protect Elena from what her adoptive parents had believed would be painful knowledge. The Rodriguez family had known about Jomar's existence but had been advised by social workers that contact between the separated siblings might interfere with Elena's adjustment to her new life and family structure. The decision to maintain the separation had been presented as temporary, a brief period of adjustment that would eventually allow for supervised visits and continued relationship between the brother and sister. But as months passed and Elena adapted successfully to her new environment, the temporary separation had gradually become permanent, justified by the belief that disrupting her progress might cause psychological damage that could affect her future development and opportunities. David's revelation that her adoptive family had possessed information about Jomar's whereabouts for years but had chosen not to share it, created a new layer of emotional complexity that Elena struggled to process. The protective intentions that had motivated their silence felt like betrayal when viewed through the lens of nearly 30 years of unconscious searching and persistent dreams about the brother she had convinced herself was nothing more than childhood imagination. Sophia's innocent intervention had accomplished what decades of professional success and personal achievement had failed to provide: the return of the family connection that Elena had been unconsciously seeking her entire adult life. The child's determination to reunite her father with his sister had cut through layers of adult caution, legal complications, and social expectations that had maintained their separation long after the original reasons for it had ceased to be relevant. The afternoon sun streamed through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows as Elena realized that her carefully controlled corporate world was about to be transformed by the presence of a brother whose very existence challenged everything she thought she knew about her family's history and her own identity. Sophia sat peacefully beside her, satisfied that her mission had been accomplished, unaware that her simple act of courage had just initiated changes that would ripple through multiple lives and transform the definition of family for everyone involved. The legal documents that officially recognized their sibling relationship took 4 weeks to process through Miami-Dade County's family court system, but the emotional reconciliation that mattered most happened in the parking garage of Rodriguez Automotive Empire, witnessed only by Sophia and the security cameras that captured the moment when Elena Rodriguez finally embraced the brother she had been unconsciously searching for her entire adult life. Jomar arrived at the corporate headquarters that Friday evening after receiving Elena's carefully worded phone call, his hands still bearing traces of engine oil despite multiple washings, his work clothes exchanged for the cleanest shirt he owned. The underground garage felt different this time, transformed from a sterile corporate space into something that felt almost sacred as he waited beside the same Maserati that had brought them together, wondering how his life could change so completely in the span of 2 weeks. Elena descended from her executive tower carrying a banker's box filled with documents that she had spent the afternoon gathering from various sources. Legal papers that confirmed their shared parentage, medical records that showed matching blood types and genetic markers, school photographs from her childhood that included images of the brother she had forgotten but never stopped missing. The evidence painted a picture of 2 lives that had diverged dramatically after their separation, but had remained connected through invisible threads of family DNA and persistent dreams. Sophia watched from her position near the elevator bank as the 2 adults approached each other with the careful uncertainty of people navigating emotional territory that had no clear maps or established protocols. Her 8-year-old perspective had simplified what seemed impossibly complex to the grown-ups. They were family, they had found each other again, and everything else was just details that could be worked out through patience and love. The conversation that followed was stripped of the corporate formality and working-class deference that had characterized their previous interactions. Elena spoke about the emptiness that had driven her relentless pursuit of business success, the persistent feeling that achievement was meaningless without family to share it with, the dreams that had haunted her sleep featuring a brother whose face she could never quite remember upon waking. Her voice carried the vulnerability of someone admitting to feelings she had spent decades trying to suppress through professional accomplishments and material acquisitions. Jomar listened with the patient attention that Sophia had always associated with her father's approach to mechanical problems, breaking down complex issues into manageable components that could be understood and addressed methodically. He shared his own story of aging out of the foster care system, learning automotive repair through necessity rather than choice, the loneliness that had accompanied every major milestone in his life, because there was no family to witness his struggles or celebrate his modest victories. The revelation that they had been living in the same city for 8 years while remaining completely unaware of each other's proximity felt like a cosmic joke with devastating implications. Elena's corporate empire had flourished less than 30 miles from the garage where Jomar had been rebuilding engines and supporting his daughter, their paths never crossing, despite sharing the same geographic area and probably frequenting some of the same businesses and public spaces. David Chen joined them in the parking garage as the evening deepened, bringing with him a manila envelope that contained additional family photographs and documents that the Rodriguez family had preserved but never shared with Elena. The images showed their biological parents, Miguel and Carmen Santos, whose faces bore striking resemblances to both their adult children. Wedding pictures revealed a young couple whose happiness seemed to radiate from the faded photographs, their joy untainted by knowledge of the tragedy that would eventually separate their children and scatter their family across different social and economic worlds. The story that David revealed filled in gaps that neither Elena nor Jomar had been able to reconstruct from their fragmented childhood memories. Their parents had died, not in a simple car accident as the official record suggested, but while traveling to a job interview that might have improved their family's financial situation. Miguel Santos had been offered a position as a mechanic at a luxury car dealership, an opportunity that could have provided stability and better prospects for his children's future. The irony that Elena had built her fortune in the same automotive industry, where their father had sought better opportunities, created another layer of connection between their separate life paths. Jomar's natural mechanical abilities and Elena's business acumen in the luxury car market suddenly seemed less like coincidental talents and more like inherited traits that had expressed themselves differently based on their divergent circumstances and opportunities. Sophia produced her latest artwork from her backpack, a drawing that showed 3 figures standing together beside a building that looked remarkably like Rodriguez Automotive Empire. The sketch was titled Complete Family in her careful handwriting and depicted Elena, Jomar, and herself with matching smiles and linked hands. The image captured her vision of how their relationships should function once all the adult complications were resolved through simple acceptance of obvious truths. The practical arrangements that followed their emotional reunion required navigating complex social and economic differences that couldn't be resolved through good intentions alone. Elena's wealth created opportunities but also potential complications as they worked to establish authentic relationships that wouldn't be distorted by financial imbalances or social expectations about how siblings from different classes should interact with each other. Jomar's initial resistance to Elena's offers of financial assistance or employment opportunities reflected his determination to maintain the dignity and independence that had sustained him through years of struggle. He valued the skills he had developed through necessity and took pride in supporting Sophia through his own labor, rather than accepting charity that might compromise his sense of self-worth or create dependencies that could damage their newly recovered family dynamic. The solution they eventually developed honored both Elena's desire to share her success with her family and Jomar's need to contribute meaningfully to their relationship. Rodriguez Automotive Empire's service department had been outsourcing specialized mechanical work to various independent contractors, but Elena created a consulting position that would allow Jomar to provide expert technical services while maintaining his own garage and continuing to serve his existing customer base. The arrangement provided Jomar with increased income and professional recognition while preserving his autonomy and entrepreneurial independence. Elena gained access to mechanical expertise that enhanced her company's reputation for superior service. But more importantly, she secured regular contact with her brother and niece that felt natural rather than forced or artificial. Sophia adapted to her expanded family structure, with the flexibility that children often demonstrate when adults are willing to prioritize love over convention. She divided her time between her father's modest apartment above the garage and Elena's spacious Coral Gables home, treating both environments as equally valid parts of her world, rather than seeing them as representing different social classes or economic opportunities. The annual Rodriguez Automotive Empire charity gala that year became the setting for their first public appearance as a reunited family. Elena's introduction of Jomar as her brother surprised many attendees who had never heard her mention siblings, But the obvious affection between them and Sophia's proud explanations of how she had been instrumental in bringing them together created a narrative that the Miami business community found both touching and inspiring. Standing together on the stage where Elena typically delivered corporate presentations about quarterly earnings and strategic initiatives, the three of them represented something more meaningful than professional success or financial achievement. They embodied the possibility that broken families could be repaired, that love could transcend social and economic differences, and that sometimes the most important victories were personal rather than professional. Sophia's closing remarks to the assembled business leaders carried the kind of simple wisdom that only children possess when they decide to explain complicated adult situations through direct observation and logical thinking. She thanked everyone for attending the fancy party, but explained that the real celebration was having her complete family together for the first time in her memory, with her father and her aunt finally in the same place where everyone could see that they belonged together. The applause that followed acknowledged not just Elena's business achievements or the evening's charitable purpose, but the courage of an 8-year-old who had refused to accept that some separations were permanent and some family bonds couldn't be restored through determination and love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.